Tonight, we're stepping into a strange time in history, the mid-14th century, when the Black Death was sweeping across Europe, North Africa, and beyond, when the air itself felt suspicious, when every cough in the marketplace turned heads, and every shadow in the alley felt like bad news waiting to happen. This is the story of how people tried and failed to outsmart the plague. From bird-beaked doctors to garlic-stuffed pockets, from burning sweet herbs in the streets to locking whole towns behind their own gates, the solutions range from desperate to downright absurd. If these strange stories from the past help you drift off, a quick tap on, like and subscribe helps us keep bringing more of them to your night. So dim the lights and settle in as we wander into the strange history of a world obsessed with keeping death locked outside its doors. The pestilence arrives. It is the middle of the 14th century. The calendar, if you could afford one, would say the year is 1347. But the truth is, most people don't measure life in years. They measure it in harvests, in births, in the number of times the river is frozen over. And lately, they measure it in something else entirely. The streets are quieter than they should be. The market stalls in towns and cities stand half empty. The bright chatter of trade replaced by low murmurs and quick exchanges. Some people have taken to avoiding eye contact altogether, as if even a glance might carry misfortune from one person to the next. There are rumours, wild, persistent, impossible to ignore. A sickness is moving across Europe. It comes from far away, from lands most people here will never see. They say it began beyond the great trade roads, somewhere in the east, carried by merchants and sailors who did not know what they carried until it was too late. No one has a name for it yet. Later they will call it the Black Death, a name that will echo for centuries. For now, it is simply the pestilence, a word that needs no explanation. You say it in the market and people instinctively take a step back. It is a sickness that moves with the wind, or so people believe. It can arrive without warning, striking down the healthy and the frail alike, and in a world without microscopes or medicine as we know it, the mystery is almost worse than the danger. Imagine living in a time when the causes of disease were invisible. You could not see the bacteria in a drop of blood. You could not point to the flea on a rat and say, "There, that's the culprit." All you knew was that people who were laughing and drinking in the tavern one day might be gone the next. Faced with such terror, the human mind does what it has always done. It looks for patterns. It searches for explanations dash. And perhaps most importantly, it searches for ways to fight back. Some of these ways will be clever. Some will be desperate. And some will be so strange that centuries later you may wonder if they were real at all. But they were. Every single one. The year the pestilence first arrives in Europe, ships dock in Messina, a port in Sicily. On board, sailors are sick, some already dead. The locals, horrified, send the ships away, but the damage is already done. The sickness travels faster than fear itself, and fear travels fast. By the time it reaches the great cities, Florence, Paris, London, it is not just an illness, but a shadow hanging over every street. Doctors, such as they are, find themselves overwhelmed, and so advice begins to circulate. Not the kind of advice you might expect, like wash your hands or avoid crowds, though to be fair, they had some version of that last one. Instead, the advice is shaped by the beliefs of the time, by the humours, by astrology, and by the old idea that the world itself can be poisoned. This is where our story begins, not in this moment of outbreak, but in the scramble to outwit it. The strategies people will try are as varied as they are misguided. Some will cost fortunes, some will cost lives, and nearly all of them will fail. But in failure, they will give us something, a window into the medieval mind, a glimpse at how ordinary people understood health, danger and survival. And more if we're being honest, a few ideas that are so absurd you almost have to admire the creativity. So tonight, as you settle under your blanket and let the modern world fade away, imagine yourself in that time. A time before electricity, before trains, before the idea of a germ even existed. Your tools are simple: fire, herbs, superstition. And somewhere in the distance there is a rumour of illness moving ever closer. You've heard the whispers in the market. You've seen the worried faces. You know that sooner or later you will have to decide what you will do to protect yourself and the people you care about. Do you trust the city's doctor, with his long-beaked mask stuffed with herbs? Do you follow the priest's advice to pray and fast? Do you copy your wealthy neighbour who has fled to the countryside and locked the gates? There is no right answer, only choices. And, as we'll soon see, some of those choices are unusual. This is the story of how people tried and failed to avoid the plague. It begins, appropriately enough, with the belief that if bad smells could make you sick, good smells might just save your life. The smell theory. In the 14th century, the air itself could not be trusted. Not the crisp breeze rolling in from the hills, not the warm draught from an open bakery door. If it carried the wrong scent, something foul, sour, or rotting, it could be deadly. This was the guiding principle of what doctors and scholars called miasma theory. The idea was simple enough. Bad smells cause disease. Good smells keep you safe. It sounds quaint now, but in a world without microscopes or any understanding of bacteria, it made a certain kind of sense. If sickness often appeared in places that reeked of waste and decay, surely the smell itself was the culprit. And so, the logic followed: to survive, you needed to live in a cloud of pleasant aromas, as though your nose was a moat, and scent the water that kept the enemy at bay. In the busy market square of a medieval town, you might see merchants going about their business with small cloth bags tied to their belts. These were filled with dried herbs, lavender, sage, rosemary, to create a personal bubble of fragrance. Some took it a step further, clutching bunches of fresh flowers as they walked. The more fragrant the bouquet, the better your chances of survival, or so it was believed. Nobles had their own upgrade to this tactic, the pomander. This was a hollow ball made of silver or gold, often intricately decorated, and filled with a mix of aromatic substances: cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg, dried roses, a portable spice cabinet worn around the neck or attached to the belt. Some were small enough to fit in the palm of the hand. Others were the size of a small apple, swinging heavily as their owner moved. And of course there were the plague doctors, those ominous figures in long black robes and bird-like masks. The beak of the mask was stuffed with herbs, spices, and occasionally vinegar-soaked sponges, meant to purify the air before it reached the lungs. In theory, it was a practical design. In reality, it was more like wearing a medieval potpourri display on your face. These fragrant defences weren't limited to the rich or the medical profession. Children were given small pouches of herbs to carry to school. Travellers tucked sprigs of rosemary into their clothing before setting out. Some people wore garlands of garlic or onions, which had the added benefit of keeping away not only the plague, but also most dinner invitations. The most determined practitioners of the smell theory turned their entire homes into scented fortresses. Windows were kept open to let fresh air in, and bundles of herbs were hung from rafters, tucked into corners, and even placed under pillows. The goal was to create an unbroken shield of fragrance, as if the pestilence would stop at the door, take one whiff of lavender, and decide to bother someone else. In some ways, the theory wasn't entirely off the mark. Bad smells often did come from sources of disease, stagnant water, rotting food, overflowing waste pits. Avoiding those places would have reduced the risk of catching something. But the plague wasn't floating in foul air. It was travelling by flea and rat, slipping past the scented defences without the slightest difficulty. Still, when fear takes root, it grows in strange directions. If your neighbour was clutching a bouquet of roses and survived another week, that was proof enough. Never mind that the roses might have had nothing to do with it. And so, the markets did a brisk trade in herbs and flowers even as other goods slowed to a trickle. A good batch of cloves could fetch a price far above its usual value, not just because it smelled nice, but because it promised safety. And in a time when hope was as scarce as grain, that promise was worth paying for. From a distance, a city in the grip of the smell theory might almost seem festive. Everywhere you looked, people were carrying flowers, wearing perfumed jewellery, or waving scented cloths in front of their faces. It could almost pass for a celebration, until you noticed the empty houses, the shuttered shops, the quiet tolling of church bells. The truth was, these pleasant scents were often a kind of armour, thin and fragrant, meant as much to comfort the mind as to protect the body. And for many, that comfort was enough to make it worth the effort. Even now, centuries later, you can find echoes of the smell theory in modern life. We still reach for scented candles, air fresheners and perfumes, not to ward off plague, but to shape the air around us into something more bearable. It's a reminder that sometimes survival isn't just about staying alive, it's about making the world feel livable while you try. But as history shows, when it came to the plague, no amount of roses or cloves could stop what was coming. And for those who believed in the smell theory, the next logical step was obvious. If a little fragrance was good, a lot of it must be better. Aromatherapy on steroids. If the smell theory was the seed, then aromatherapy on steroids was the fully grown and slightly deranged tree. Once people accepted that pleasant scents could protect them from the plague, they didn't just carry a few herbs in a pouch, they escalated. For the wealthy, survival meant turning their homes into giant, fragrant fortresses. Imagine a grand hall with tapestries on the walls, a roaring fire in the hearth, and in every available space, bundles of herbs hanging from rafters, tucked into corners, draped over furniture. The air is thick with rosemary, thyme, and juniper. Servants move through the rooms constantly, replacing wilted plants with fresh ones. It's less like a house, and more like someone tried to build a garden indoors and gave up halfway. One favoured method was burning herbs around the clock. Rosemary, sage, and juniper wood were especially popular, producing clouds of aromatic smoke that filled the home. The idea was that the smoke would drive out or neutralise the bad air, that the pestilence wouldn't be able to survive in a haze of herbal goodness. In some cases, this created a pleasant, almost spa-like atmosphere. In others, especially in smaller rooms with poor ventilation, it was less like a spa and more like slowly roasting yourself in a medieval incense burner. There's a record from Florence of a noblewoman who kept rosemary burning in her home so constantly that the walls turned black from soot. Her neighbours claimed they could smell her house from the street, which, depending on your opinion of rosemary, was either delightful or unbearable. For those who preferred a wetter form of scent warfare, there was boiled vinegar. You'd set a pot on the fire, fill it with vinegar, sometimes with added herbs, and let it steam until the whole room smelled like a salad dressing factory. It was believed the acidic vapour would cleanse the air and make it impossible for the plague to take hold. Did it work? No dash. Did it make your eyes water, your throat burn, and your furniture smell faintly pickled for weeks? Absolutely dash. Some households took the concept mobile. If you had to go outside, you could carry a small brazier, essentially a portable fire pit, filled with burning herbs. The wealthy might have a servant walk ahead of them, wafting smoke in their path to purify the air before they breathed it in. This was both a status symbol and a practical inconvenience. Imagine trying to navigate a crowded market while someone swings a pot of smouldering sage in front of you. Even public spaces got in on the act. In some towns, city officials ordered bonfires in the streets, piled high with aromatic wood and greenery. The idea was to create a scented barrier around the community, like a giant invisible wall of perfume. Unfortunately, this also tended to attract crowds, and if there's one thing you don't want during a plague, it's large groups of people huddled together breathing the same air. Occasionally, these extreme scent defences had side benefits. Some herbs and smokes do repel insects, and since fleas were the real culprits behind the plague, a heavily smoked household might have reduced its flea population without realising it. But the effect was inconsistent at best, and probably outweighed by all the times people left their scented sanctuaries to mingle in plague-ridden streets. Still, there was something reassuring about the smell. You could close your eyes, inhale deeply, and pretend, if only for a moment, that you were safe, that the world beyond your perfumed walls was not dangerous but merely distant. And so the burning continued, day after day, week after week, until whole neighbourhoods smelled like spice markets or, in the case of the vinegar enthusiasts, like failed cooking experiments. This escalation of the smell theory shows something important about human nature. When we find a solution we believe works, we tend to double down. If a little bit of rosemary is good, then a lot of rosemary must be better. If one pot of boiling vinegar might protect you, then why not 3? It's the same logic that drives people today to take 12 vitamins instead of 2, or to pour extra detergent into the washing machine just to be sure. And just like now, sometimes the extra effort makes things worse, not better. But for medieval plague survivors, worse didn't necessarily mean death. It might just mean red, irritated eyes and a lifelong hatred of sage. And that seemed a fair trade if it meant avoiding the pestilence, even if the protection was purely imaginary. Eventually, though, the reality would sink in. The scented walls, the clouds of smoke, the endless pots of vinegar, none of it stopped the plague from finding its way in. And when it did, the same households that had been fragrant fortresses became quiet, dark, and empty. Those who remained began to look for other explanations. Maybe it wasn't the air at all. Maybe the danger was something else entirely. something that could enter not through the nose, but through the skin. The no-bathing movement. If the smell theory told you to surround yourself with pleasant aromas, the no-bathing movement took a different approach. Don't give the plague an opening. Literally. Medical thinking at the time leaned heavily on the idea of pores, tiny gateways in the skin that could let in air, moisture, and, unfortunately, sickness. Hot water, it was believed, opened these gateways wide. Step into a steaming bath, and you were essentially throwing open the gates to the pestilence, rolling out a welcome mat, and offering it a drink. And so, the advice began to spread. Avoid bathing during an outbreak. In some places, it became an unwritten rule. A kind of grim hygiene truce. If we all stink, at least we stink together. Bathhouses, once lively centres of social life, fell silent. In towns across Europe, the big public bathhouses shuttered their doors, not just because of fear of contagion, but because customers stopped coming. Why risk opening your pores when you could keep them sealed under a protective layer of whatever had been building up since your last wash? Medieval bathhouses were more than just places to get clean. They were meeting spots, gossip centres, and for some, unofficial business offices. Closing them was like shutting down all the coffee shops in a modern city. You could feel the absence in the rhythm of daily life. Of course, not everyone agreed with the ban on bathing. Some stubborn souls continued to wash in secret. Sneaking buckets of water into private rooms or taking quick dips in rivers. But these risk-takers faced social pressure. If your neighbours thought you'd been bathing, they might avoid you for fear you were now open to infection. And then there were the extreme adherents. For them, water wasn't just risky. It was practically poisonous during a plague year. They would go months, even years, without a proper wash, letting sweat, oils and dust build up until their clothes seemed almost glued to their bodies. It wasn't pretty. But it was considered prudent. Some physicians even recommended substituting baths with dry cleaning, not the kind with machines and plastic garment bags, but with cloths, powders, and perfumes. You might rub yourself down with a rough linen to scrape off the top layer of grime. Then dust your skin with crushed herbs or scented powders. The goal was to freshen up without inviting the disease. This is where the lines between medicine and vanity blurred. People started wearing extra layers not just for warmth, but to trap their body's natural oils against the skin, creating what they thought of as a barrier. It's hard not to imagine this protective coating as less of a shield and more of a marinade. The irony is that while avoiding public bathhouses might have reduced exposure to crowds, which could, in theory, help during an epidemic, the lack of hygiene created its own problems. Lice and fleas, the real plague carriers, thrived in unwashed hair and clothing. So the very people trying to protect themselves by staying sealed were often giving the real killers free room and board. But without the knowledge we have today, the choice seemed reasonable. After all, if your neighbour avoided bathing and survived the season, it was proof enough that the strategy worked. Never mind the neighbour's constant scratching. Some even took the philosophy beyond water and avoided anything that might heat or open the body. Spicy foods, vigorous exercise, and even certain emotions were thought to be dangerous. It was a time when staying calm, cool, and slightly sticky was considered the height of plague prevention. The no-bathing movement also had a strange cultural side effect. Smells became part of identity. Without the regular washing away of scents, people began to recognize friends and family as much by their personal aroma as by their faces. It wasn't necessarily unpleasant to them. It was simply how life smelled. Perfumes and scented sachets gained popularity here too. Though unlike in the smell theory, the goal wasn't to cleanse the air but to mask what was already there. Think of it as medieval deodorant, applied liberally to both people and clothing. And so, entire communities moved through plague years in a kind of shared grubbiness, convinced that the less they washed, the safer they were. The streets might have been quieter, but the air, well, let's just say it had character. Of course, some took things even further, adding extra defences on top of their unwashed state, layers of scent so strong they could stun a passerby. And that takes us to our next chapter, where we meet the practitioners of what might be the most aromatic strategy of them all, the armour of stink. If the no-bathing movement was about sealing the gates, the armour of stink was about building a moat made entirely of smell. The idea was simple. If bad air could bring the plague, then surrounding yourself with your own powerful aroma might keep the pestilence from getting close enough to matter. It wasn't about smelling good, quite the opposite. The goal was to smell strong. For some, this meant taking the smell theory and twisting it. Instead of carrying pleasant herbs in a pouch, they rubbed themselves directly with garlic or onions. These pungent coatings were thought to fortify the skin, making it impossible for sickness to pass through. Garlic was especially popular, not only for its scent but for its supposed warming quality, which in medieval medical thinking balanced the body's humours in a way that discouraged disease. Of course, the garlic defenders never seemed to agree on dosage. Some swore by rubbing it just on the wrists and neck. Others preferred a full-body application. It's safe to say that if you could smell someone before you saw them, they were a full-body believer. Then there were the musk wearers. Animal musk, harvested from deer, civets, or even beavers, was prized for its intense lingering odour. To modern noses it might smell exotic and perfumed when refined, but in its raw form it was far more challenging. Worn in small pouches around the neck or sewn into clothing, musk was believed to repel illness by overpowering any corrupted air before it could reach the lungs. It wasn't cheap either. To walk through the streets with a visible musk pouch swinging from your belt was not just a sign of plague preparedness, it was a statement of wealth, and perhaps a warning to anyone within sniffing distance. For those without access to musk or endless cloves of garlic, there were other options. Dried herbs, strong ones like rue, wormwood and tansy, could be crushed and sewn into the seams of clothing. Some people even stitched small pouches into the linings of their cloaks or hoods, ensuring that every movement released a faint cloud of their chosen scent. It was a mobile defense system, a kind of wearable air filter, if you didn't mind smelling like an overstocked apothecary. Others took inspiration from the animal kingdom, quite literally. There are scattered reports of people wearing small animal parts, like dried toads or bits of fur, believing they had protective properties. The reasoning was a strange blend of superstition and symbolism. If an animal part had once been alive, perhaps it could absorb the sickness before it reached the person wearing it. It's not clear whether anyone tracked the effectiveness of plague toads, but the fact that the idea persisted says something about human desperation. The armour of stink wasn't just physical, it was social. If you smelled aggressively unpleasant, people tended to give you a wide berth, and in a world where close contact was risky, that extra space might have been the only genuinely effective part of the whole strategy. Imagine walking through a crowded market. The fishmongers shout their prices, the bakers pull fresh loaves from their ovens, and there you are, cutting a path through the throng, your garlic and musk aura parting the crowd like a ship through water. You might not have stopped the plague, but you certainly reduced your odds of bumping into anyone carrying it. Of course there were drawbacks. Strong smells cling to everything. Your clothes, your bedding, even the walls of your home. Visitors, if you had any, might leave with your scent embedded in their own clothing. And in households where multiple people practiced the armour of stink, the combined odours could become complex. It also created a kind of olfactory hierarchy. Some smells were associated with wealth, fine musk, imported spices. Others, like garlic and onions, were considered the scent of the commoner's defence. If you wanted to make a statement, you didn't just want to smell strong, you wanted to smell expensively strong. Looking back, it's tempting to laugh at the idea of building an invisible aromatic shield against the plague, but in a way it makes sense. When faced with an unseen, unstoppable threat, people will grasp at anything that gives them a sense of control, even if it means becoming a walking onion. And unlike some plague prevention methods, the armour of stink was unlikely to harm you. It might harm your social life, but in plague years, that was arguably a benefit. Still, not everyone was content with external defences. Some believed the best way to fight the plague was from the inside out, to consume protective foods and drink so the illness could never take hold. And that belief leads us to a whole new category of plague prevention. Weird food cures. If some people wore their plague protection, others preferred to eat it. The idea was simple. Fortify the body from the inside out and the pestilence wouldn't stand a chance. In practice, this meant swallowing some of the most questionable remedies ever recorded in the history of medicine, and calling it dinner. Garlic was the undisputed champion of the edible defences. Its strong scent and sharp taste made it a favourite for those who believed that what could repel vampires might also keep away the plague. Some people ate cloves raw with every meal, their breath announcing their presence long before they spoke. Others preferred garlic-infused broth, the medieval equivalent of a health drink. Physicians recommended it for its warming qualities. In the theory of humours, it balanced the body and burned off bad influences. Raw onions had their own following. They were thought to draw out disease almost like sponges for sickness. You could eat them sliced, crush them into pastes, or even sleep with them under your pillow. If that sounds uncomfortable, remember, comfort was a luxury in plague times, and smelling like a kitchen garden was considered a fair price for survival. Vinegar also had its place on the medieval plague fighters' table. Some people drank it straight, a sharp, throat-burning ritual, believing it cleansed the body of impurities. Others soaked bread in vinegar for a quick, portable remedy. It was also added to wine or water to purify the drink. While vinegar does have some antibacterial properties, it wasn't exactly enough to stop Yersinia pestis, the bacterium behind the plague. But in the absence of real medicine, every sip felt like action. Then there were the fad diets. One school of thought said to avoid fruit entirely. Too moist, too cooling bad for the humours. Another insisted that eating nothing but fruit would keep you safe, as the body would be light and pure. Some went all bread, others all meat. It was a buffet of contradictions, each backed by confident, if entirely unproven, medical advice. Wine lovers found a way to make the theory work for them. They drank heavily spiced wine infused with cinnamon, cloves, or pepper, believing the heat and spice would purge the body of infection. The fact that it also made life under quarantine more tolerable was no doubt a welcome side effect. Of course, the wealthy had their own culinary extremes. One particularly extravagant cure was powdered emeralds. Yes, actual gemstones ground into fine dust and mixed into wine or broth. The idea was that emeralds contained life-preserving energies, the same logic that made people wear them as amulets. If wearing an emerald could keep you safe, surely drinking one would be even more effective. The flaw in this plan was obvious. Powdered gemstones are not only expensive, they're also not great for your insides. Pearl powder had its fans too, especially in Italy. It was taken with honey or dissolved in vinegar, believed to strengthen the heart and improve resistance to disease. If nothing else, it was a way to display wealth even in the shadow of death, a reminder that you could afford to ingest what most people could never touch. Some of these edible defences blurred the line between food and medicine. Special plague biscuits were baked with aromatic herbs like rosemary and sage. Broths were brewed with long lists of protective ingredients, some of which might have made for a decent soup, others that were purely for show. A few recipes strayed into the realm of the bizarre. One 14th century text recommends eating roasted snake to guard against plague. Another suggests cooking a whole chicken, then eating it without removing the feathers, as if crunching through plumage might confuse the illness on its way in. These strange diets weren't just about health, they were about control dash. In a time when so much was uncertain, you could at least decide what you put into your body. Following a strict food regimen was a way to feel proactive, even if the science behind it was non-existent. And while the edible cures did nothing to stop the plague, some of them probably improved morale, and maybe even nutrition, in a time when stress and scarcity wore everyone down. A garlic-laden stew might not kill bacteria, but it might make you feel just a little stronger, and that feeling counted for something. Still, even the most devoted garlic eater or emerald drinker knew that food alone wasn't enough. Sometimes the only real defense was to put distance between yourself and the disease. If the plague was in the city, you went to the countryside. If it was in your village, you found somewhere else to stay. If you couldn't leave, you sealed yourself in and hoped for the best. And so our final chapter in this half of the story turns to the strategies of space, the medieval art of staying far, far away. Social distancing medieval style. Long before the phrase social distancing entered modern vocabularies, medieval people had their own version, though it looked very different from 6 feet of space in a supermarket line. For those with the means, it was a strategy of escape isolation, and sometimes elaborate self-imposed exile. The most straightforward approach was to get out of town. If you were wealthy enough, you packed up your household and headed to the countryside at the first whisper of plague. Landowners fled to remote estates. Merchants retreated to country villas. The idea was simple. If the plague was in the city, you went where there were fewer people, and fewer opportunities for bad air to drift your way. This was not a quick weekend trip. Families might stay away for months, even years, waiting for reports that the danger had passed. Letters were scarce and rumours more common, so deciding when it was safe to return was as much guesswork as anything. Those without rural estates improvised. Some rented small cottages on the outskirts of towns. Others camped in the open fields, choosing the discomfort of makeshift shelters over the risk of crowded streets. It was the plague-era equivalent of moving into a tent in your backyard because your house might be cursed. For those who stayed in the city, vertical distance was the next best thing. If you could, you moved to the upper floors of tall buildings, believing the pestilence clung closer to the ground. The higher you lived, the further you were from the dangerous air, at least in theory. It was an approach that offered a nice view, if nothing else. Others took isolation to architectural extremes. Some noble families barricaded themselves in their homes, sealing windows and doors with tar or pitch to keep bad air from seeping in. Food was lowered from upper windows or brought by trusted servants who lived separately from the main household. The goal was total disconnection from the outside world, a medieval bubble. This approach had obvious flaws. A sealed house quickly became stuffy and unpleasant, and unless you had a generous supply of food and water, you were at the mercy of the outside deliveries. In some cases, the isolation itself became dangerous, with households running out of supplies or unable to summon help when illness struck anyway. Still, there were those who thrived in seclusion. Writers, scholars, and certain monks used plague years as a time to focus on work emerging months later, with completed manuscripts or new studies, and presumably a strong aversion to company. Some towns tried collective distancing. Markets moved outdoors to open fields. Church services were held in courtyards instead of cramped chapels. Travel between towns was sometimes restricted, with guards posted on roads to turn away outsiders. These measures were more effective in theory than in practice. A determined traveller could usually find a way around the rules. And of course, human nature often got in the way. Loneliness, boredom, and the pull of routine brought people back together, whether at secret gatherings or simply on the street. Every market day, every clandestine festival was a gamble. In the countryside, isolation had its own challenges. Fewer people meant fewer opportunities for infection, but also fewer resources. A broken plough, a sick cow, or a failed crop could become life-threatening without the safety net of nearby neighbours or markets. The choice to leave the city was as much a test of self-sufficiency as it was a medical decision. Even with these challenges, distance worked better than most plague prevention methods, not because it stopped bad air, but because it reduced contact with the fleas and rats carrying the disease. By sheer luck, the instinct to get away sometimes put people out of reach of the true culprits, even if they did not understand why. But distancing was never foolproof. The plague had a way of finding its way down lonely roads and into remote valleys. And when it did, all the miles in the world could feel like nothing at all. Still, for many, keeping space, whether by fleeing to a country estate, climbing to the top floor, or sealing themselves inside their homes, was the best option they had. It was an act of hope in its way, a belief that you could outwait something that felt unstoppable. And so, with this final chapter of Half 1, we have walked through the first wave of medieval plague prevention. The fragrant shields, the smoky barricades, the abandonment of bathing, the proud armour of stink, the edible defences, and the desperate attempts to stay far away from danger. None of it truly worked, at least not for the reasons people believed. But each strategy offers a glimpse into a world trying to understand the incomprehensible, and into the lengths humans will go to feel safe. In the second half of this story, the methods will grow stranger still. Processions of penance charms and talismans, bloodletting, the infamous chicken under the armpit cure, and the ways fear itself sometimes became the plague's best ally. But that, dear listener, is for another night. Religious and magical protection. In the Middle Ages, sickness was rarely seen as just a physical problem. It was a spiritual one too. The plague wasn't simply a disease. It was a test, a punishment, a sign that something in the order of the world had gone terribly wrong. And when faced with danger on that scale, many people turned to the most powerful forces they knew: faith, prayer, and the unseen protection of holy things. Church bells rang not only to mark the passing of the dead, but to call the living to special services. Priests led processions through streets, chanting prayers and carrying crosses high above the crowd. The idea was to drive the pestilence away through the combined force of devotion, to cleanse the air with sacred words just as others tried to do with burning herbs. Sometimes these processions grew into enormous gatherings. Entire towns would walk together, singing hymns, reciting litanies, and carrying relics. The bones of saints, pieces of the true cross, or other sacred objects believed to have miraculous powers. The air was filled with the sound of chanting, the smell of incense, and the shuffle of hundreds of feet moving as one. To those who believed these were moments of profound hope, to the plague which thrived in crowded spaces, they were a perfect opportunity. Holy water was another common defence. Sprinkled over doorways, flicked onto faces, even mixed into drinking water. It was thought to bless and purify whatever it touched. Some people carried small vials of it as a kind of spiritual emergency kit, ready to anoint themselves or others at the first sign of danger. Relics and charms were worn close to the skin, often around the neck. A pendant containing a fragment of a saint's robe might hang beside a small metal cross. Some wore medallions stamped with prayers in Latin, believing that the words themselves carried protective power. For those who could not afford such treasures, even a scrap of cloth touched to a relic was considered valuable. The boundary between the religious and the magical was thin. Talismans with Christian symbols shared space with amulets drawn from older pre-Christian traditions. Bits of carved bone, engraved stones, or charms inscribed with mysterious symbols dash. It was a kind of spiritual hedging. If one form of protection failed, perhaps the other would succeed. In rural areas, wise women and folk healers blended these traditions freely. A blessing might be followed by the tying of a knotted cord, each knot representing a prayer for health. An herbal poultice could be accompanied by a whispered charm to bind the illness and keep it from spreading. Even homes were given spiritual defences. Small crosses were painted over doorways in blessed chalk. Scripture verses were written on slips of parchment and nailed above beds. Some families kept candles burning night and day before images of saints, believing the steady flame would guard the household. And for all their simplicity, these acts brought comfort. In a time when medicine could offer little, the presence of a familiar prayer or a trusted charm was something to hold on to. A reminder that not every force in the world was hostile. Of course, faith and superstition could also lead people into danger. Large gatherings for processions, relic viewings, or mass blessings often became hotspots for transmission. Those seeking the protection of a famous relic might travel for days to reach it unknowingly, carrying the plague with them, or bringing it back home. But such risks were often invisible to the people of the time. If someone fell ill after attending a procession, it might be seen not as the fault of the gathering, but as proof that they needed even stronger spiritual protection. In some towns, the church itself became the centre of plague defence. Clergy would bless entire streets, walking from house to house, with incense burners swinging clouds of scented smoke, mingling with whispered prayers. Masses for the dead were held daily, sometimes continuously, in the hope of easing souls through purgatory and encouraging divine mercy for the living. For those who survived such a season, the memory of these rituals was lasting. The sight of a golden reliquary glinting in the sunlight, the weight of a charm against the skin, the sound of a prayer repeated like a heartbeat. These were as much a part of the plague years as the fear itself. And yet, for all the hope these protections offered, there were some who believed that prayer alone was not enough. That true repentance required more than words, more than relics or holy water. It required action that was often as painful as it was public. And so from the same streets where relics once passed in solemn processions, a new kind of march began. One where the faithful took the fight against the plague into their own hands, quite literally. The self-flagellation movement. If religious processions were about hope, the self-flagellation movement was about penance. Hope's darker, harsher sibling. For some, the plague was not just a test from God, it was punishment for sin. And if the sickness was heaven's judgment, then perhaps the only cure was to show the depth of human repentance in the most dramatic way possible. Enter the flagellants dash. They were groups of men, and occasionally women, who travelled from town to town dressed in simple robes, sometimes stripped to the waist, carrying heavy leather whips or knotted cords. Their processions were slow, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. At each stop they would gather in the main square or outside the church, kneel in silence, and then rise together. And then the whipping would begin. The whips cracked against bare skin, leaving red welts that quickly opened into bleeding cuts. The sound was rhythmic, almost like the beat of a drum, each stroke accompanied by murmured prayers or chants. The flagellants believed that by inflicting pain on themselves they were sharing in the suffering of Christ, taking on punishment that might otherwise fall on the whole community. It was an act meant to cleanse the soul, to prove to God that they were truly repentant, and to beg for mercy on behalf of everyone watching. And people did watch. Crowds gathered in silence, some weeping, some crossing themselves, some joining in. The movement spread quickly in the mid-14th century, especially during the height of the plague. In some regions, flagellant groups would arrive almost daily, bringing their strange mix of spectacle and devotion. They stayed for a set number of days, often 33 and a half, representing the number of years in Christ's life, before moving on to the next town. While in residence, they lived simply, often sleeping in barns or church porches, relying on the charity of the townspeople for food. Their presence was both a source of fascination and a reminder of the plague's constant shadow. The church's official stance on flagellants was complicated. At first, some clergy welcomed the display of repentance, seeing it as a powerful communal act. But as the movement grew, concerns arose. Flagellant groups often operated independently without the oversight of local priests, and their teachings sometimes drifted into territory the church found troubling. There were also practical concerns. Large gatherings to witness the processions became potential breeding grounds for the plague itself. Ironically, in their attempt to drive the sickness away, the flagellants may have been helping it spread. Still, for the participants, the ritual was deeply meaningful. Each lash of the whip was a prayer, a plea for forgiveness, a declaration that they would endure pain now to spare the community greater suffering later. Some claimed to have visions during the processions, of saints, of angels, even of the Virgin Mary offering blessings for their sacrifice. For onlookers, the flagellants were a living example of extreme devotion. They were proof that there were still those willing to put themselves between the plague and the people, even if that barrier was made of blood and faith rather than medicine. Not all towns welcomed them. In some places, officials barred their entry, fearing unrest contagion. or simply the disruption to daily life. In others, they were received like visiting saints, given food, lodging, and gifts in thanks for their intercession. Their processions were unforgettable. The slow march into town, the steady sound of bare feet on cobblestone, the metallic tang of blood mingling with the scent of incense and candle smoke, all of it left a mark on those who witnessed it. And while the movement eventually waned, partly due to church opposition, partly because the plague outlasted their efforts, its impact lingered in memory and in the pages of chronicles. For the flagellants, the logic was unshakable. If sin had brought the plague, then only repentance could remove it. For others, the logic was questionable. After all, many towns with flagellant processions still suffered heavy losses. But in a time when no one understood the real cause of the disease, even the sight of strangers suffering on your behalf could feel like a kind of protection. Yet there were other remedies on offer, ones that didn't require you to take up a whip or join a religious march. They came instead from the realm of medicine and science as it was understood at the time. These were the dangerous remedies, the ones that promised to purge sickness from the body, but often harmed the patient more than the plague itself. Dangerous remedies. When the plague came, fear often outweighed caution. If a treatment had even the faintest logic behind it, or simply came from someone wearing a long robe and a serious expression, people were willing to try it. And so many turned to remedies that in hindsight did more harm than good. One of the most common was bloodletting. Rooted in the ancient theory of the four humours, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, bloodletting was meant to restore balance in the body. The idea was that sickness came from an excess of one humour, and the quickest way to correct this was to remove some of it. In the case of plague, that meant opening a vein and letting the blood flow until the patient was pale, dizzy, and supposedly purged of illness. Barber surgeons carried small sharp knives or special lancets for the task. Sometimes leeches were used instead, applied to the skin and left to feed until they swelled with blood. It was messy, uncomfortable, and often dangerous, especially for patients already weakened by fever. Some people fainted, others never woke again. Then there were purges. If sickness could enter through the mouth, perhaps it could be expelled the same way, forcefully. Doctors prescribed powerful laxatives or emetics to cleanse the body from within. These concoctions were often made from herbs like senna, rhubarbs or aloe, mixed with wine or broth. The results were exactly what you would expect: hours of misery, dehydration, and in many cases an even weaker immune system. Some remedies straddled the line between medicine and poison. Mercury, for example, was sometimes applied to the skin in ointments or taken in tiny doses, believed to drive out impurities. The logic was that something so potent, so noxious, could surely scare away the plague. In reality, it was more likely to scare away your remaining health. Lead-based treatments were not uncommon either, used in creams and pastes meant to cool inflamed swellings. While these might have offered momentary relief, they also quietly introduced heavy metals into the body, a slow, invisible danger. Herbal remedies could be just as risky, especially when dosage was left to guesswork. Strong plants like hemlock, foxglove, and wolfsbane were used in tiny amounts for their supposed healing powers. But tiny amounts in the hands of an inexperienced apothecary could quickly become lethal. The difference between a medicinal dose and a fatal one was often a matter of a few extra leaves. Other treatments were bizarre rather than directly toxic. One method involved placing the patient in a closed room and heating it to unbearable temperatures, under the belief that sweating out the sickness would work. Another was to lay the patient in an ice-cold bath to shock the body back to health. Neither worked, except perhaps to shorten the ordeal by hastening the inevitable. In some cases, these dangerous remedies were combined, creating a gauntlet of suffering for the patient. A person might be bled in the morning, purged in the afternoon, and rubbed with mercury ointment by evening. If they survived, it was likely due more to luck than to the treatments themselves. And yet it is important to remember that these methods were not born of cruelty. Most healers truly believed they were helping. The knowledge of the time simply did not allow them to see the harm they were causing. When the plague was an invisible enemy, every tool in the kit seemed worth a try. For the sick and their families, agreeing to such treatments was often a matter of hope, even desperate hope. If the patient improved, the remedy got the credit. If they worsened, it was blamed on the severity of the disease, not on the cure. But among the many dangerous remedies of the plague years, one stands out for its sheer oddity. It did not involve bleeding or poison, yet it was still thoroughly unpleasant. It called for the use of a live animal, specifically a chicken, in a way that would raise eyebrows in any century. The chicken under the armpit cure. Of all the plague cures history has preserved for us, the potions, the purges, the poisons, few can match the sheer commitment and creativity of the chicken under the armpit method. Yes, this was an actual medical treatment. Yes, it involved a living chicken. And yes, if you're picturing a scene where someone in a robe earnestly presses poultry to a sick man's sweaty underarm while nodding gravely, you're not far from the truth. The theory, if you can call it that, was rooted in the belief that illness could be drawn out of the body and into another living thing. This was not unusual thinking for the Middle Ages, after all. This was a time when people believed you could transfer a wart to a frog or cure madness by inhaling the scent of roses at the right phase of the moon. With plague, healers decided that chickens, preferably plucked around the event, yes, the chicken's bottom, were nature's perfect sponge for disease. The instructions were simple, if disturbing. First, you would catch a chicken. Second, you would remove the feathers from its rear end to expose the bare skin. Third, you would place this unfortunate end of the chicken snugly under the patient's armpit, ensuring maximum skin-to-skin contact. Why the armpit? Because plague swellings, the notorious buboes, often appeared there, swollen and tender. The belief was that the chicken, by some mysterious property, would draw out the poison from the bubo into itself. The chicken, being a hardy creature, would theoretically absorb the illness without dying. This is, of course, not what happened. In practice, the chicken was just as confused about the situation as the patient. Records do not say much about the bird's reactions, but one imagines a lot of flapping, squawking, and scratching, which, combined with the patient's fever, must have made for a rather chaotic sick room. Once the chicken showed signs of fatigue, interpreted as taking on the disease, it was removed and a fresh chicken was applied. Yes, fresh. You did not reuse a plague-sucking chicken. The used bird was sometimes washed and rested in case it could be deployed again later, but more often it was killed. This was not, however, done out of mercy for the chicken. Rather, it was to prevent the disease from leaking back into the patient. As strange as it sounds, this was not an obscure rural superstition. Chroniclers from Italy, France, and England all recorded variations of the chicken cure. Some even recommended adding herbs or vinegar to the chicken's bare skin before application to activate its disease-drawing powers. One Italian doctor in the 14th century claimed to have saved dozens of patients this way, although, given the mortality rate, his definition of saved might have been flexible. The chicken method had some unintended side effects. For one, poultry was not cheap during plague times, when trade was disrupted and food scarce. Using multiple birds per patient was a sign of wealth or desperation. This led to an odd social signal. If you walked into a sick room and saw several restless chickens waiting in baskets, you knew the family was either well off or very determined to keep Uncle Pietro alive. Secondly, it occasionally backfired. Handling live chickens in close quarters could spread other illnesses, including salmonella, lice, or mites. In rare cases, the patient ended up sicker from the treatment than from the plague, though that was hard to measure when both were usually fatal. Humorously, not all patients complied with the full instructions. Some refused to let the chicken touch bare skin, insisting it sit over cloth. Others skipped the plucking step, resulting in an extremely awkward and ineffective cuddle with a fully feathered bird. One 15th century satire even poked fun at a nobleman who insisted on having a goose instead, because it felt more dignified. The chicken under the armpit cure eventually fell out of favour as plague outbreaks subsided and medical understanding advanced. By the 17th century, it had become more of a cautionary tale, a look how far we have come example for medical students. Still, it lingers in the historical imagination because it is such a perfect blend of earnest belief, bizarre execution, and unintended comedy. And perhaps that is the real lesson. In the face of fear, humans will try almost anything, even if it involves plucking a chicken and tucking it under your arm like a feathered hot water bottle. It was not science, it was not effective, but it was, undeniably, one of the strangest chapters in the long history of trying and failing to outwit the plague. Which brings us, quite naturally, to the people who saw all this panic not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. Because where there is fear, there is profit. And in plague times, the plague profiteers knew exactly how to make a living off misery. Plague profiteers. If the plague was a disaster for most, it was a goldmine for a certain kind of person. The type whose moral compass spins wildly whenever there was a whiff of profit in the air. And during the Black Death, that air was thick with both disease and opportunity. Merchants, apothecaries, and street sellers realized that fear itself could be packaged, bottled, and sold at a premium, and they did it with a salesman's grin. In bustling market squares, stalls popped up like mushrooms after rain. Only instead of vegetables or bread, they offered plague protection kits that promised to keep death at bay. Inside was a few dried herbs, a scrap of cloth scented with vinegar, and sometimes a mysterious powder that looked suspiciously like ground-up chalk. Prices tripled overnight. The sellers knew you would pay anything if you thought it meant seeing another sunrise. Apothecaries were some of the most skilled profiteers. They mixed concoctions with exotic names, elixir of eternal breath, the bishop's breath of life, which cost more than a month's rent. These brews were made from whatever ingredients they could source: rosemary, camphor, vinegar, or in more desperate times whatever was lying around that did not actively smell like a corpse. Buyers did not ask questions. They just handed over coins and prayed it worked. Then there were the travelling peddlers, who arrived in villages with carts piled high with charms, talismans and blessed trinkets. A silver cross that had been touched by a holy man, a rabbit's foot blessed by a monk, a small leather pouch of herbs guaranteed to repel the plague. Most of these items were as holy as a turnip, but desperation made people believe. Some peddlers even staged elaborate shows, coughing dramatically as they entered town, then miraculously recovering after sipping their own miracle cure. Villagers lined up, coins ready. Not all profiteering was subtle. Bakers doubled the price of bread, knowing that with so many fields abandoned, grain was scarce. Some butchers sold meat that was questionable at best, passing it off as fresh. And grave diggers, grim as their work was, demanded extra pay for premium burial spots closer to churches, claiming they would keep loved ones' souls safer. Perhaps the boldest profiteers were the counterfeiters. Fake coins and debased currency flooded markets as people fled cities and tried to carry their wealth with them. Some merchants accepted the fakes without caring, as long as they could pass them along to someone else. Others demanded payment in gold or silver, hoarding it for themselves while insisting paper notes and copper coins were worthless. The church was not immune to temptation either. Some clerics sold indulgences, documents promising forgiveness of sins and safe passage to heaven, for a price that conveniently rose with the death toll. Pilgrims desperate for spiritual comfort would pay whatever they had left, believing it might spare them from eternal damnation. The irony, of course, was that some of these indulgences were forged by opportunists who had never set foot in a church. This new economy of fear created strange side effects. Some towns banned certain sales entirely, worried that profiteers were spreading panic, or worse, spreading the plague intentionally to boost demand. But banning the sales only pushed them into back alleys and hidden courtyards, where whispers of the real cures were traded like contraband. And yet, in the midst of all this greed, there were a few rare souls who gave their remedies freely, charging nothing for herbs, advice, or prayer. They were often mocked by their more mercenary peers, but when the plague finally receded, they were the ones remembered kindly, their names passed down in stories, while the profiteers were cursed, their descendants insisting they were completely unrelated. The profiteers did not disappear when the plague ended. They simply moved on to the next fear, the next rumour, the next disaster that could be squeezed for profit. Because if history teaches us anything, it is that in every crisis there will be those who run toward danger to help, and those who run toward it to sell something. And with that, we step toward our final chapter, a reflection on the strange, sad, and often ridiculous attempts to cheat death, and what, if anything, we have actually learned from them. Lessons learned and forgotten. When the final waves of the plague loosened their grip, the survivors crawled out from the shadow of death into a world that felt lighter and emptier all at once. Streets that once echoed with cartwheels and chatter now hummed with silence. Entire neighbourhoods were gone, yet somehow people got back to the business of living. Humans have a strange talent for rebuilding right on top of disaster, like cats stretching out on the warm ashes of a burnt house. In the years after towns tried to make sense of what had happened, councils met, laws were written, and public health, a term nobody had really used before, started to take shape. Quarantine became an official policy rather than a desperate guess. Some cities required travellers to wait outside their walls for weeks before entering. port towns built plague houses, places where new arrivals could stew for a while until they were deemed probably not contagious. It was an imperfect system, but it was the start of something that looked like organized disease control. Markets slowly reopened, though the paranoia never really left. People still carried herbs in their pockets, wore little cloth masks soaked in vinegar, and avoided handshakes like they were passing on a live rat. Some of these habits faded over time. Others, like keeping certain streets wider for better air, became part of city planning. Even superstition left its mark. Certain houses were rebuilt with symbols carved into the wood, or painted above the door just in case evil spirits decided to drop by again. For many, the plague years had rewritten the value of time. Before, a man might work for decades, saving slowly for the promise of comfort in old age. After people began spending more freely, marrying earlier, or setting off to see the world while they could still breathe without coughing up their lungs. This new life is short. Philosophy was the plague's most unexpected legacy, and for every person who used it to create joy, there was another who used it as an excuse to drink away their inheritance. There were also the lessons nobody seemed able to hold on to. Cities that had once enforced strict sanitation slipped back into old habits when memories faded. Rubbish piled up in alleys. Rats returned, and with them fleas that had never entirely gone away. The same mistakes that had helped the plague spread were repeated within a generation. Because while survival teaches us a lot, comfort has a way of making us forget. Even the profiteers found their way back into business. The fear market simply shifted to whatever new doom was trending. Witchcraft, famine, foreign invaders, bad weather. If there was panic, there was a product. History's con artists never retire, they just update their sales pitch. And yet there is an undeniable stubbornness to the human story. For every forgotten rule, there was a seed of change that took root. Quarantine became standard practice for centuries to come. Cities invested more in freshwater systems. Hospitals expanded, and doctors, even the ones who had worn those nightmare bird masks, started keeping better notes, slowly transforming medicine from guesswork into something approaching science. The strangest lesson of all might be this. Despite the horror, people still laughed. They still held weddings in quiet chapels, told jokes at market stalls, and sang songs in the taverns, sometimes about the plague itself. Gallows humour became a way to poke at the darkness without letting it swallow you whole. In that laughter, you can hear the sound of people refusing to be reduced to numbers in a death ledger. Centuries later, we look back and marvel at the absurdity of their cures, the cruelty of their profiteers, and the bravery of the few who truly tried to help. But the truth is, if another plague arrived tomorrow, much of what we would do would look strangely familiar. We would scramble for answers, cling to charms, argue about what is safe, and find ways to sell each other solutions. Good and bad. Because history is not just what we have learned. It is also what we keep relearning over and over, dressed up in new clothes. And maybe that is the most human thing of all, that in every era, no matter how strange we keep trying, we keep hoping, and somehow we keep laughing in the dark.